Another type of analytic study design that is often used in health research is the cohort study. A cohort study essentially tracks the incidence of a specific disease or health outcome over a period of time. Something that makes a cohort study is the use of a cohort in this particular study design. This is defined as a population group or some sort of subset that has a specific characteristic in common that is followed over a given period of time. So, for example, a birth or age cohort could be used. You could have a work cohort, so people that work at the same place. A school or educational cohort, you could have a group of people that go to the same school, for example, Cal Poly. When we're thinking about cohort studies versus case control studies, in a case control study, you don't have a defined cohort of people. You're selecting cases and then trying to find similar controls. Whereas a cohort study, there's some sort of defined population where you're following essentially that cohort of people over a given period of time. There are two types of cohort studies. The one that you're probably most familiar with is the prospective cohort study. This is essentially a type of longitudinal study, but we can also use what we call a retrospective cohort study. A prospective cohort study, this is basically where we are classifying subjects at some baseline point in time. We're classifying them in terms of their exposure status, and then we're following those people over time, and we're seeing across those groups, we're documenting the occurrence of new cases or the incidence of whatever health condition we are observing. Here's a visual representation of what this looks like. So we have some baseline time period in which we are recruiting people into our cohort. So we could have a work cohort, a school cohort, it doesn't really matter. But at this baseline point, we get those people into our study and we've got some cohort. And in that cohort, we are going to have people who are considered to be exposed. And then we might also have people who are considered to be unexposed. So within that group of people who we're going to follow, we have exposed people and we have unexposed people. And then what we do is after assessing that exposure status at some baseline, we are going to follow that cohort over a period of time. That period of time could vary. It could be weeks, it could be years, it could be over a lifetime. It really doesn't matter. But the idea is that we continue to collect data on those individuals, and then what we do is we then prospectively, we collect their disease status at some follow-up time period where we actually look to see in these two groups whether someone has the disease or doesn't have the disease. And what we can then do is essentially look at the incidence rate of the disease in the exposed as well as the incidence rate of the disease in the unexposed group. This is really helpful because we can establish that this exposure happened before this outcome happened, allowing us to really establish a temporal relationship between our variables of interest. A retrospective cohort study is the same thing, but the directionality of the study is different. So in a prospective cohort study, we are recruiting people, we're examining that cohort's exposure status at some baseline time period and then following them prospectively over a period of time. In a retrospective cohort study, that data has already been collected and we are looking at historical data to determine the individual's exposure level at some baseline in the past. So there is still this exposure in the past and then the occurrence of the disease, but we're just looking at historical data that's already been collected. So your textbook gives you this example of a study of mortality among an occupational cohort of shipyard workers employed at a specific naval yard during a time interval in the past. So let's think about this from a visual perspective. So as a researcher, you're starting at this endpoint here. And what you're doing is you are essentially taking historical data that's already been collected. You're not actually collecting the data is already there, and you're looking at that historical data of that cohort. You can see the outcome status, and you can also see the exposure status using that historical data. So let's look at employees of, in this example, of a tire manufacturing factory. And let's say that we have all the employee records of all these individuals in this cohort. And so what we can see is that the employees who worked with the chemicals in the manufacturing process, let's say that that's the exposed group, and the clerical workers and management who were maybe not in the field working, those are going to be the unexposed people who were not exposed to those chemicals in that manufacturing process. So rather than recruiting that cohort and following them over decades and decades, if we already have an entire set of employee health and employment records from the previous 2 to 3 decades, we can look at that and conduct a retrospective cohort study. In essence, we are going to kind of jump back and look back in time using those records to look at that cohort at some point in the past. So we can look at their employment status based on that historical data and categorize people into exposed or unexposed based on those employment records. And then we can also look at the records we have to determine their outcome status. So in this particular study, that outcome could be death. So we could look at their health records to see whether or not they died as that outcome. Typically, when we conduct retrospective cohort studies, we're taking data that exists that we didn't really plan to use for a cohort study. It's that we've stumbled upon a collection of data that has historical information on a cohort of people, and then we use that to try and examine the relationship between an exposure and an outcome. Cohort studies have advantages as well as disadvantages. One of the big advantages is that you get to directly observe the risk. So you can actually measure incidence rates in your exposed and your unexposed group and actually calculate a relative risk, which is a direct observation of risk. We calculate those incidence rates, and it's really helpful in quantifying the actual risk. The exposure factor tends to be really well defined. This is something that you're measuring very closely at the beginning of the study, and you're doing it before the outcome. You can study exposures that are uncommon in a population in a cohort study, and we know the temporal relationship between whatever exposure factor we're looking at and that outcome variable. Some disadvantages is that they can be really expensive and they can be time consuming. Cohort studies can follow people over decades. This makes them really complicated and difficult to carry out. We often lose subjects to follow-up during the course of the study, and if we have unequal loss to follow-up in cohort studies, it can lead to bias, which is something we'll talk about later on in the quarter. And then it is possible that we can misclassify people's exposure status, and that can cause issues in a cohort study as well.